Okay. So welcome everyone. This is the MPA webinar as part of the Southwest Marine Ecosystem series of webinar, the conference and the annual report. So this will run from 1 to 3 p.m. and we have a total of 6 talks, very exciting talks. And we'll be covering key updates and research on marine protected areas, things that's happened over the last year. And also we'll be looking into the future of MPAs and what could we do. So we'll start with updates from our regulatory and advisory bodies, and we have Natural England, the Marine Management Organization, and W7 IFCA. And then after these, we will have a quick 5-minute break, and then there will be other 3 talks from the Wildlife Trust and Plymouth Marine Laboratory. So instead of having a Q&A session after each of the talks, we will have like a dedicated longer Q&A discussion session at the end. And as I mentioned before, I will record all the talks, but we won't record the discussion, and you can find all the talks on YouTube later on. So you can drop any questions in the chat at any time. We just will address them at the very end. And at the end, I would really like for it to be open discussion, open Q&A. So you can just unmute yourself and turn your camera on if you'd like and ask your questions directly. Of course, put your hands on first. But yeah, so if you would like me to read them out, put them in the chat. But otherwise, you're very welcome to do it yourself. But yeah, so we'll go straight on to our first speaker. That's Kate Sugar. She's Marine Senior Advisor for the Devon, Cornwall and Isle of Scilly team with Natural England. And Kate will give us an overview of the MPA network and the progress check on conservation advice and condition assessment and updates on current MPA policy initiatives. And I think Kate might also give us a bit of info on their MEL work and what that means for our MPA network. So floor is yours, Kate.
Thank you. I'll just try and sort my presentation out, which was a bit tricky. So have I got the right view yet or not?
We can see your notes at the moment.
So is that the right view? Is that better?
We see a blue screen for now.
Yeah, that's because I've gone forward a slide. This is so difficult. Right, is this the right view?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. I'm Kate Sugar, Senior Marine Officer for Natural England. In case you're not familiar with Natural England, we're the government's advisor for the natural environment in England. And I'm just going to give an overview of where we are with our MPA network in the Southwest and maybe what's next. So thinking about the Southwest in terms of geography, there's always been a kind of blurry boundary for what is Southwest in terms of Southwest marine ecosystems, but I'm taking it in this part of the talk to mean Devon, Cornwall and Isles of Scilly because that's what I've got the figures for in terms of what we got in our MPA network. But later on in the presentation, I will talk a bit more generally about the region. So this is our MPA network. As it stands, we've got 10 SAC, Special Areas of Conservation. Those are the pink ones. 4 SPAs, Special Protection Areas, which are designated for bird protection. Those are the sort of green ones on the map. And we've got 37 marine conservation zones, which are the most newly designated ones. And they are purple on the map. We've got 2 Ramsar sites as well, which overlap our SPA designations for birds. So in total, we've got 53 marine protected areas, which hasn't changed in the last couple of years, but it is a lot compared to the number we had just over a decade ago. To put it in context, that's about 1/3 of the English MPA total. There's 181 MPAs designated in English inshore waters. And I haven't got the figures up here, but I think in terms of Southwest MPAs, it covers just over 30% of the inshore sea area. So that's where we are in terms of MPA designation, getting those lines on the map. But that is just one, oh, a minute. There you go, there's the numbers. That's just one metric in terms of progress for MPAs. It's the first step, definitely, but it's not the end point. So I'm going to talk a bit about what comes next. This is a simplified version of a flowchart that we have sort of look at internally in Natural England, and it helps us visualize our work relating to MPAs, the MPA cycle. But once a site is designated, so it comes in at the top there, comes into the cycle, Natural England has a duty to give advice on how to further the conservation objectives for that MPA. And our advice has to identify any activities that are capable of affecting the features of the MPA and all the processes that they depend on. And we do this by writing and publishing a conservation advice package online for every MPA. And we are also required to look at the condition for sites. So how are they doing? We have a standardized condition assessment methodology that was introduced nearly 10 years ago now. And in the Southwest, we completed our first site condition assessment in 2017. And the approach just takes an MPA, looks at the features and the sub-features and the targets that are set for those features, and using best available evidence, works out whether those targets have been met or not. And then if you move around the cycle, another stage looking at best available evidence, we also run a survey and monitoring programme to help collect the evidence that's used to help us write or update the conservation advice or the condition assessments. So this is a really simple version of a flowchart, and actually all the arrows go both ways and between all of the components there. But it's just to make the point really that the designation of an MPA is the easy part in a way. There's a lot of work that comes afterwards to make sure that the sites we have are protected effectively, which isn't in itself site management, but it's the basic building blocks for that effective site protection. So the conservation advice and the condition assessments for each MPA and the evidence behind them are really important. So how are we doing with them? I don't have an easy way to display progress with survey and monitoring for MPAs because that's quite complex, but focusing on the conservation advice and the condition assessment, because those are the bits of the process that are totally within Natural England's control. Conservation advice, we are 98% complete. This is for Devon, Cornwall, and Isles of Scilly. So we have one MPA left to write a conservation advice package for. It's a very terrestrial MPA. It's Braunton Burrows in North Devon. It's largely intertidal and sand dune interest, but it has fallen within our remit. So that one is still to be completed, but we're pretty much there in terms of having online conservation advice for all our sites. Condition assessment, slightly different picture. We're 23% complete. So this is talking about that methodology that was introduced in 2016. So we've applied this process already to our SACs and MCZs, and this year we've started working on our SPA sites as well, but it is really frustratingly slow progress. We've completed assessments for 68 features across 14 sites, which is great, but to put that into context, we're looking at a total of 288 features across 53 sites that should be assessed every 6 years. So there has been progress over 2024, but there's still a lot to do. So moving on to sort of progress with management, a lot of this I will leave to speakers coming after me because I know we've got the MMO and we've got Devon and Severn IFCA representatives here today. So I'm sure they'll cover some of this. But just in terms of headlines of what happened in 2024, we had the MMO introducing a bylaw announcing proposals to restrict bottom-towed gear in some sites. In May, the MMO also announced a programme of work to assess sites for managing non-licensable activities. And I'm sure they'll talk about that in a minute. July 2024, we had election and new government, which isn't directly related to management of MPAs, but it sets the context for all the work and can sometimes mean a sort of change of approach or change of direction. And actually in July, the new Secretary of State announced a rapid review of a document called the Environmental Improvement Plan, which was completed last year. And that does potentially have relevance for our MPA network, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then at the end of December 2024, so just past, that was a DEFRA sort of deadline for appropriate fisheries management to be in place across all our MPAs. So that's the IFCA's and the MMO responsibility, following assessment of the impacts of fishing activities on those sites. And this has been an absolutely massive programme of work, particularly for the IFCA's over the last decade. It is now broadly completed, but there are still some sites, some outstanding sites where a Assessments have yet to be completed, or management is yet to be brought in, but the bulk of that work has been done. So we've done well at designating MPAs in the Southwest. There's a lot of work in progress to get all the information for those MPAs published, keep them monitored, keep assessing them to make sure the right management's in place. But there are still some sites, quite a few sites, that have had minimal monitoring and no condition assessment yet. So there's still very much work to do. Also worth flagging that as that whole, thinking back to the cycle, as that process of monitoring and condition assessment and updates to conservation advice continues, we would expect management of sites to keep evolving to respond to new information that might come up about site and feature condition. So it should be a constantly changing and evolving picture, moving around that cycle of advice, monitoring, assessment, and so on. It's not a job you can finish, it's one that's going to keep going. But there is reason for optimism in terms of ongoing work with our MPAs. So there's some national and international commitments that are driving work around MPAs in England, and it's worth covering here just for some context. You've probably all heard of 30 by 30, but just to recap, the UK has committed to protect 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030, hence 30 by 30. And that's to support a global 30 by 30 target that was agreed at a UN Biodiversity Summit in 2022, also known as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. But I think 30 by 30 is a lot snappier. So the UK's commitment to this target is held within that Environmental Improvement Plan, or EIP, that I mentioned was reviewed last year. And in October 2024, the government published a policy paper on the criteria and the next steps for 30 by 30 on land and inland waters. So not strictly covering work at sea, but they did reference work towards 30 by 30 at sea, saying that at the UK level, we've actually got 38% of our seas covered by MPAs when you're just looking at area alone. But the government don't see this as job done, which is a good thing. And they have acknowledged that the priority now has to be to ensure that all of those sites we've got are properly protected. So achieving 30 by 30 at sea won't be so much about designating new sites, it will more be about implementing further management measures for the ones we've got. The EIP also holds government commitments to ensure that MPA features are in favourable condition. So that's the other two targets I've got up on the slide. So we've got a legally binding target under the Environment Act from 2021, which states that no less than 70% of protected features in MPAs must be in favourable condition before the end of 2042, with the remaining protected features to be in a recovering condition. 2042 sounds like a really long time away at the minute, although I'm sure it will rush up. But there is an interim target as well, which is outlined in the EIP, which is for 48% of features in favourable condition by 2028. And I think at the point where they set the target, there was estimated that about 40 something percent of features were in favourable condition. So theoretically, it shouldn't be a leap to get to 48% in favourable condition by 2028, but we'll see. And Natural England, alongside JNCC, will be advising government on monitoring and reporting on the progress towards this. So they might seem a bit dry, it might seem like just numbers, but it's really because we've got these commitments and targets internationally and nationally agreed, and in some cases legally binding. So because of that, they're really effective and they're driving a lot of the work around our MPAs at the minute. So they are worth knowing about. But what else is new? What comes next? What's new and on the horizon? So having a look beyond what happened in 2024, there's just two things I think that are worth mentioning. One is that we have an MPA network review that was announced, I think, by the Minister in this January. And the aim of the review is to understand how the existing MPA network can better address biodiversity loss, be more resilient to climate change, support food security, and meet net zero targets. And it was announced as an opportunity to find ways to optimise the existing network and update management priorities. So alongside JNCC and CFAS, Natural England will be delivering ecological analysis to help underpin this review, and that will be going on throughout this year. and be DEFRA-led, and DEFRA will be seeking stakeholder views throughout the process. So there's a big sort of interesting opportunity there. And then something else that was announced in January this year, there's a written ministerial statement at the end of January confirming DEFRA's intention to designate new MPAs and or extend existing MPAs in our waters to deliver strategic compensation for unavoidable damage to seabed habitats as a result of offshore wind farm deployment. So this is a sort of newly announced compensation measure. It's been developed in collaboration with stakeholders through this whole programme called COUST, Collaboration on Offshore Wind Strategic Compensation. And it's currently the only option that's been agreed by the statutory nature conservation bodies, the environmental NGOs, and the offshore wind sector as suitable for benthic impacts. So when you have these impacts on a seabed habitat from building wind farms, how are you going to achieve compensation? And everyone at the minute has agreed that this is an appropriate thing to explore, so designating new sites or extending existing sites. And it's hoped that implementing this will help to move forward some offshore wind projects that were at risk at the moment due to lack of ecologically effective options that developers can take to deliver compensation for seabed impacts. So some projects were getting stuck at that stage in the process where there is a known impact from their proposed development, but nobody really knew what to propose for how to compensate for that impact. So again, there's not very many details available yet, but you can have a look at the written ministerial statement and all the associated materials online. They're not expecting this to be a massive designation programme, so not a large scale thing. So the total area of MPAs required for compensation is expected to be quite small. The aim is to protect benthic habitats, so it's very much focused on those seabed habitats. And there will be a lot of opportunity for stakeholder input to any designation process. And it's not a new designation process, it's going to follow established legislative processes. So there's a huge amount of work going on at the moment in terms of our MPAs and marine management in general. There's this whole work around refreshing the Environmental Improvement Plan, the EIP, which has a lot of our sort of targets and aims in it. There's a lot of pressure on government to progress good environmental status for the marine environment more widely, not just thinking about MPAs. And there are ongoing investigations by the OEP, that's the Office for Environmental Protection, and the Environmental Audit Committee, which is a parliamentary committee, all looking at really scrutinising how the government is doing in terms of protecting the marine environment. And then we've got the international and national commitments and targets around MPAs. We've got the MPA network review. And we're going to obviously see a very large scale development of our offshore wind capacity over the coming years. So there's a lot going on. There's going to be absolutely loads of change. But I do think there is also quite a lot of opportunity for our MPAs and the network as a whole. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I will stop sharing, I think.
Thanks a lot, Kate. That was very interesting. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about it later. I definitely do have some. But for now, we're gonna move over to Brian and Jess from the MMO. They're gonna talk us through the MMO's work on MPA by law compliance and also tell us a bit more about a fairly new bit of work around marine non-licensable activities. So I'm gonna you go on with
Thank
it.
you. I'll share my screen. That one there, hopefully. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm Ryan, MPA enforcement manager in the offshore monitoring team in the Marine Management Organization. Jess has a slide at the end. I'll allow her to introduce herself for that one. I'm standing in for Tom, who's on the call as well. He's a little ill today, can't deliver a long, lengthy talk like this, so I've stood in. So I might not be able to answer all the questions on the management side from the marine conservation team, but Tom's there, Jess is here as well, so they'll pick up any questions about that in the discussion later on. And I'm here for mainly the enforcement and compliance side. So going into the presentation. So what we're going to discuss first briefly address the elephant in the MPA. I'm not sure which MPA that one is there that the elephant's swimming in. But it looks quite nice, though, nice and warm. Probably Tom last year, was it, discussed our stage 3 MPA project during these webinars. So for anyone not already aware, this project's in assessing fishing activities in the 43 offshore MPAs outside of 6 nautical miles and determining appropriate fisheries management measures for the sites. And we're very aware there's been little public update or news on this since then. But we do want to confirm that we have made significant progress with this project internally in the MMO and still very much committed to the management of fishing activities in the offshore MPAs and consulting on our draft management measures. However, we're not unfortunately able to provide an update on when the consultation will take place, but we are doing everything possible that we can to launch the consultation ASAP. What we can update you on, though, however, from our MPA fisheries management perspective, is that stage 2 measures did come into force nearly a year ago now, towards the end of March 2024. And that was prohibitions on bottom-towed fishing gear in MPA reef habitats. And since then, there's been good compliance with these, which obviously I'm going to go through. And also with the stage 1 MPA management measures, which was various fishing gear prohibitions in the canyons. So that is one of the southwest ones, and South Dorset MCZs, as well as Inner Dowsing, Racebank and North Ridge SAC and Doggerbank SAC in the North Sea. Looking at the southwest in particular, the canyons is one of our main problem child, if you like, for this for the southwest area, and we've had a few other incursions into, not many of them. Cape Bank tends to have a little bit of activity, mainly British, but we can go through some of those as I go through the presentation. What are we using then for monitoring? So our tools to try and instill compliance. Those of you who might not have seen it before, the image there on the left is a tool called TEMIS. That's what we use to observe the vessel monitoring system. It's a GPS monitoring system that is installed on all vessels over 12 meters, fishing vessels over 12 meters. So that just shows us the fishing vessels or related vessels, so maybe scientific research ones that have VMS. Our own patrol vessels have VMS, and some of the foreign patrol vessels do as well. So we use that to monitor all the fishing activity, UK and foreign, in British waters. And sometimes we see outside of our waters as well, depending on different agreements that we have with different nations. There's a similar tool called Telesto. I believe it's designed and run by the Royal Navy, but has input from a lot of other marine and security organisations in the UK. And that one mainly deals with what's called AIS, Automatic Identification System. So that's for a lot of commercial shipping will have that for navigational safety. So in case it's foggy or something, they can see on their computer systems there's another vessel up ahead, just in case their radar isn't working properly as well. We get to see that. We get to use it somewhat in our enforcement as extra evidence, but VMS remains our primary source. We also have systems through which we can access electronic logbooks. Again, this is regulated. The fishers of vessels over certain sizes need to input logbooks to say that they've been doing fishing activity, or that they haven't been doing fishing activity. Maybe they're on guard vessel duties. So we see a lot of fishing vessels go into the Dogger Bank where the wind farms are. But if they've inputted that they're on guard duty, we can look up which companies that they're on guard duties with to confirm that. And then we know that even though it looks like they're potentially doing fishing patterns, we know they're actually guarding a wind farm or guarding a pipeline. So a very useful system. And then the offshore patrol vessels, so that one in the middle is one of our 2 offshore patrol vessels that we have. They're basically rig support vessels. sort of rescue vessels. You can see down the side there, there is a rescue zone on the side. So they've got a large back deck. So if we needed to, we could recover lost gear from the water. We could potentially, it's not something we do at the moment, but in the future we might have methods installed to recover gear that's put in the wrong areas. So if there is any static gear put into an MPA where it shouldn't be, we could further down the line potentially remove that, and then we've got a place to store it on deck. And these have 2 vessels on board that can travel up to 30 to 40 knots, I believe. So we can catch up with fishing vessels that decide to run away from our mothership. So yeah, all round very good tools, very comfortable for our teams on board as well. And we also use the Coast Guard's aerial assets from time to time as well, especially for areas like the canyons. We try and book flights, try and get them regularly, especially when we do see activity down there, or we expect activity when certain fisheries are likely to open. However, this is very limited by weather conditions, maintenance conditions of the aircraft, and also crewing of the aircraft. So we've had a fair few flights cancelled, unfortunately, in the last year. But hopefully that's going to improve over summer as the weather improves. Here's one of our flights that occurred. So we get a post-flight report from them of anything they've seen within the MPAs. So Coast Guard Agency, their flight crews have access to all the locations of the MPAs, the boundaries of them. They do tests on their GPS and their positioning systems when they first take off from known landmarks, such as lighthouses. And then they head down, they'll scour the area, depending on what we've asked them to do. Looking for, in the canyons, for example, they'll be looking for static gear that's within the canyons, or any fishing vessels that are in there, especially bottom trawlers. And then they'll come back, compile it into a post-flight report of all the vessels they've seen, show us the tracks, show us the little dots on that chart there of where they saw vessels and the names of them. And they get some pretty good imagery as well. You can actually see the gear, the wires showing the gear out in the water. So that gives us good evidence that they are very likely to have been fishing either inside or outside the area. So for the Southwest MPAs, compliance has been good. Mainly there you see the purple on each of those bars. It's no further action. So we do a lot of investigations each month, maybe about 30 to 40 vessels. That's across all 17 MPAs that we're currently looking at. So more than one a day. Some of these are just a quick take a look at it. Okay, it's doing under 5 knots. That's what flagged it to us within the area. Have a look. The tracks don't look like fishing patterns at all. Just looks like they're steaming very slowly through, and we can then disregard that one. No further action. Others need a little bit more work. So we have a look at the tracks. We look at them in context with what their tracks look like outside of the areas. Try and work out what parts of their tracks are likely to be fishing patterns. We go through their e-logs to check that they're declaring fishing. See if their gear is actually permitted, because some of them do change gear between permitted and non-permitted gear types, whether that's going from bottom trawling to pelagic. Or we just check, in some cases, they just might be drifting. So we're then looking at tidal stream data, what was the current doing, known aspects of fisheries as well. So nephroppers in Farnes East, we know them to be to drift overnight, and I believe Hayfraz in the southwest as well get some Irish nephroppers, and they do the same thing. They tend to fish during the day and then drift overnight, and sometimes that means they drift into the bylaw areas. But when we have an OPV out there, we get them to inspect some of those vessels, gather the intel, how do they fish, and we've had it confirmed that, yeah, they drift overnight. And it all matches up with the tidal stream data as well, and the speeds that they're doing. So that's why most of them become no further action. We've had a few where we issue advisory letters, and they are kind of a semi-official sanction. We can issue advisory letters to everyone if we want. We could send them to the whole fleet. We don't need to have evidence here that they have fished, but we prefer to limit it just to those where we do have suspicions that they have fished, even if we don't have the as strong evidence as we would like. Because if we just sent it out to everyone, then they're going to start questioning, why am I getting a rather official looking letter from the MMO when I haven't done anything wrong, and we don't want to get their backs up over that. So we do like to have a bit of evidence or a suspicion, at least, that they've been phishing before we send an advisory letter. And they do seem to have the desired effect as well. We send those out. Sometimes we get acknowledgements. We have our phone numbers on the letters and our email addresses. So they sometimes get responses to say, oh, sorry, didn't realize there was one there, or just to say, oh, yes, I'm aware of this. Thank you very much. We just transited through and we were fishing outside. So we do get some confirmations. But most importantly, we tend to get very few repeat offenders after these are sent out. Above that, you can send official written warnings. But at the moment, our process is that we send them to our investigations team for further investigation to see if they're hitting the threshold for an official warning, or perhaps going beyond that, and something that we could actually prosecute them for if the evidence is strong enough and the infringement seems severe enough, whether that's how long they've been in there or how far in through they've gone, and the types of gear, size of the vessel, how damaging it's likely to be. So yeah, then in those cases, we'll escalate it to our investigations team, who will then come back with a decision on that, although it does take some time, and we've got a fair few of them ongoing at the moment. When we look at these, the compliance rates between UK and other foreign vessels, absolute numbers are the same. So 2 investigations ongoing for each. This is across all areas, all MPAs, not just the Southwest, this one. Advisory letters, 4 for each. So compliance rates, I think, for all of the MPAs, given all the activity and all the fishing vessels in UK waters that are travelling through MPAs each day, these rates are very good. And then majority, no further action. And if we drill further into that, so across the Southwest MPAs, we can see here there are half of our advisory letters issued, and half of the statements we forward to our investigations team are UK vessels. That's just based on the locations where they've occurred. So Cape Bank and east of Hague-Fraz are 2 that spring to mind, with UK vessels that have gone in and been investigated. And then further afield, the other half are foreign vessels, usually down around the canyons. Across all stage 1 and 2 MPAs, then UK's infringement rate becomes a bit less, but still a big chunk of it. That's just because we obviously tend to see a lot more UK vessels in our waters and around the MPAs especially. And when we have a look then, again, not specific to the Southwest here, overall 32 ADLs, advisory letters, have been issued to different vessels, that is. And only out of that, only 2 have then reoffended. 1 gone to court, and 1 is still currently under investigation by the investigations team. The court case is set for later this year, so there's still no further updates on that one, I'm afraid. Just that is in the process of going to court. I'm not sure if it's going to trial or anything yet, though. And then for the Southwest, when we've been monitoring those MPAs, 8 cases, 8 vessels have been escalated to our investigations team for further investigations of their tracks and other details. 2 involving re-offences. Again, someone's gone in, and then they've gone in again. First one, there was one in east of Hague-Fraz, which received. Oh no, sorry, there was one in Cape Bank that I sent an ADL for the day after these MPAs came into force. And then I've seen the same vessel, the same master, go in there again just recently. So that one's been escalated because they've definitely had our advice on that one. So that'll be escalated and receive something else. One is down in the canyons, and that one is probably going to go to court, but just because of the amount of evidence, the amount of times that they've been in there, despite our asking them to stop. Just in the southernmost part of the canyons with bottom-towed gear. And the issue with the canyons is that it was once part of this vulnerable marine ecosystem set of closed areas all the way along the continental shelf. And we get a few responses from skippers who have been in these areas, say, especially with the static gear, saying, no, it's okay. I had my gear set above, above a certain depth of water, as if that's okay, even though we've actually prohibited static gear and trawled gear, bottom-towed gear, completely, no matter the depth of water. But they seem to be working off these vulnerable marine ecosystem regulations, which did have set limits of depth that they could use the gear above. So it's getting that message out to them. But most of them, as you can see from the compliance rates, have actually been paying attention, and they definitely listen when we start telling them, for the most part. And that's it for the compliance side. I'll hand over to Jess for an update on marine non-licensable activities.
Thanks, Ryan. Just one slide for this one, so I'll be quick. As we detailed last year, we also have the responsibility, along with others, for managing marine non-licensable activities, so marine recreation, in inshore MPAs, and this includes anchoring as well. This is not something MMO have looked at before, so we're getting to grips with how best to tackle it, and the approach varies with different sites, as they're all unique, as you can imagine, and have their own unique issues as well. 6 priority sites were identified in our first shortlist, and 3 of which are in the southwest. We have the Fowl and Helford SAC, which is in progress. We're doing a screening of that site, as there's a huge amount of work already gone underway in the Fowl and Helford presentation again. Great deal of progression in terms of the management that's already in place there, and the unique approaches to reducing impacts. So I'll give a little bit of an update on each, but the main concerns currently are regarding anchoring on seagrass and merle, but lots of work completed, as I mentioned. Implementation of voluntary no anchor zones, switching moorings to advanced mooring systems, and currently use of self-propelled robotic markers in Fowl and Helford for sailing events, which is fantastic. In the Plymouth Sound and Estuaries SAC, it's a priority site, obviously, for us, and it's greatly helped by the presence of a very active and local coastal partnership, as well as the National Marine Park. And there's large amounts of research already completed by various bodies, not least Plymouth University and the Marine Biological Association. There's a number of mitigation measures already in place, such as advanced mooring systems in core sands to help protect the seagrass, and we're interested to see their effectiveness. And the task for us at this stage is to review further evidence on the condition of designated features and assess the pressures they are under for marine recreational activities. And then what we're going to do is hold various engagement workshops and look at where those key pressures are in terms of where management may also be required. And the effective local consultation will be key to this success. So we will be letting everybody know we're coming out on that. In terms of the Isles of Scilly, we're yet to start further investigations on this. We've had some very early dialogue, but we would really like to hear from anyone who lives, works, or knows the area well to support us with our assessment and gathering evidence for the islands. Again, particularly it focuses on seagrass in the area, and we know that mooring in particular is having a pressure, but that's not something that's easily managed in terms of making all mooring systems advanced mooring systems. But we do hope to definitely engage with everyone on the islands, but also with visitors to the islands where we can, to help educate people about anchoring on seagrass especially. So if anyone has spent any time on the islands or works there quite regularly, it would be great to hear from you. So please get in touch if you need to. It's conservation@marinemanagement.org.uk. Thank you.
Thank you both. We are going next to James Stewart, who's Senior Environment Officer at Devon and Severn IFCA. So James is going to talk to us about the IFCA's work within inshore MPAs and future steps for their management. Thanks, James.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carly. Yes, as Carly said, I'll be talking to you about some of the work that Devon and Seven has been doing in terms of MPAs over the last year or so. I will give an introduction to IFCAs for those who aren't familiar with the work that we do. Will mean I don't have time to go into lots of detail during each of the examples, but hopefully we'll have time for that during questions as well. So can you see my just the main screen, Carly?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So just a quick introduction to IFCAs overall. They're the statutory managers of inshore fisheries, that's out to 6 nautical miles at sea, and they were formed by the Marine and Coastal Access Act, and there are 10 IFCA districts around the coast of England. And each of those 10 IFCAs has a shared vision, and that's what's shown on the screen there, which is to lead, champion, and manage a sustainable marine environment and inshore fisheries, and to achieve that by securing a balance between the social, environmental, and economic aspects of exploiting sea fisheries. And that's kind of underpinned by the text of the Marine and Coastal Access Act. Now, what you're seeing here in the grey shading is the around 4,500 square kilometre sea area of Devon and Seven IFCAs district. In that district, we're fortunate enough to have 12 MCZs, which are shown here in the red, as well as 10 European marine sites. So that's the special areas of conservation in the red hatching and the special protection areas in orange. There are also a lot of triple SIs, but I haven't shown those. It's quite a messy map and there's lots of overlap. But to manage fisheries and to protect MPAs in that area, we've got quite a small staff of 12.5 full-time equivalent officers. We've got 5 enforcement officers and 2.5 full-time equivalent environment officers. And management of fisheries in that district is carried out, it's mainly in place via 4 activity-based permit bylaws. So we've got one for each of these 4 activity types of netting, diving, mobile fishing, and potting. And each of those bylaws is supported by permit conditions, and they're represented here. So you've got things like catch restrictions, so for example, minimum conservation reference sizes, gear restrictions, temporal restrictions, and spatial restrictions as well. Now, these spatial restrictions are largely aligned with the MPA boundaries or the feature extents, including, for example, prohibitions of tow gear over reef and seagrass features, and, for example, netting restrictions in estuaries. Now, a key part of the management, which I'll probably keep referring back to, is IVMS, so inshore vessel monitoring systems. And these have been in place on the towed gear fleet in the district since 2018. And that allows us to undertake spatial monitoring of those vessels. As well as these activity-based permit bylaws, we've also got a bylaw booklet which has a lot of other management measures in as well. Now, all of these management measures are underpinned by a wide range of evidence, including, in particular, assessments of fishing activities and MPAs. So this is back to a map of the district. Across the 22 MPAs, we've conducted over 210 assessments, including HRAs and MCZ assessments, and they cover almost 2,500 different gear and feature interactions. And obviously that hasn't all been done this year, but over the last sort of decade or so, with kind of revisions as condition assessments change and fishing activities change and that kind of thing. And over the last year or so, a lot of the assessment work the environment team has been doing has been focused on the Bristol Channel approaches special area of conservation, which is this really large site in the west of the district. Now that's a site that's designated for harbour porpoise, and we're considering quite a wide range of potential pressures that fishing might pose on that species, from bycatch, disturbance and collision through to the effects of prey removal and disruption of prey habitats by fishing activities. As I said, that's obviously quite a large site compared to all the others in the district, and it's covered in part by Cornwall IFCA and the MMO as well. So we're working together where we can really to achieve the best possible outcome for that site. It's also quite interesting because the harbour porpoise only really use the site in high densities for part of the year, generally in the winter months. And something that's kind of coming through the assessments is that the threats that we're assessing are really likely to be quite a big problem kind of in a wider seas context as well. So although there's limited direct management kind of influence we can have in that wider seas context, those are conversations that we're having with, for example, the MMO. So something else that's been ongoing this year, which relates to both the assessment and the management of fisheries, is our monitoring and control plans. So these are a form of adaptive risk management that we use where there's uncertainty in our assessments. So when we complete an MPA assessment, we'll send that to Natural England for their advice. And sometimes during that process, either we or Natural England will identify that there is kind of residual uncertainties that mean we can't conclude beyond reasonable doubt that the fishing activity won't have an impact. And so those residual risks or uncertainties need to be addressed. And that's often around things like the level of fishing effort in the site. So we've developed monitoring control plans for certain activities taking place within MPAs, and these are things that we review each year, sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a monthly or less frequent basis, but they're reviewed and audited every year. So an example is of the interaction between netting and shad, which is a species which is designated in 2 sites in the district, and we've got some fishing effort monitoring and a bycatch awareness scheme in place for that as part of the monitoring and control plan. And another is relating to otter trawling on mud in Torbay MCZ. So that's a site that's closed to scallop dredge gear, but there's a small scale cuttle fishery which may use otter trawls over part of the subtidal mud feature. There were some knowledge gaps around, for example, the effect on the habitat and the level of fishing effort. So we had a DEFRA funded before or after control impact study done a few years ago to look at the habitat impacts of that otter trawling on the subtidal mud. Now, the level of activity that was tested showed no discernible impacts on the habitat. And so we have ongoing monitoring via that inshore vessel monitoring system to ensure that fishing effort doesn't exceed that threshold that has already been determined not to have an effect. So that's just one example really of where the IVMS is kind of coming into its own in terms of monitoring the kind of space use of towed gear vessels. And what we tend to find is that this isn't an area that the towed gear fleet tend to use anyway. They're generally further offshore with perhaps maybe one entry into the site each year. So other examples are looking at pots on seagrass in Torbay MCZ. So as part of our monitoring and control plan, we look at the level of fishing effort and the potential impact that might have on the seagrass, as well as looking at trawling on mobile coarse sediment in Lundy SAC. And again, we're looking there at the level of fishing effort that takes place each year. So these monitoring programs that we set up, we look at the results, and those results inform any potential changes in management of the fishing effort. So if our monitoring sees that we've reached kind of a trigger point or a trigger threshold, that will trigger us to review the MCZ assessment or the HRA for the site, and then determine whether or not further management is required. This slide just kind of recaps that, so I'll skip over that so I've got some more time. But as you will be aware, it's all very well having management measures in place, but these also have to be enforceable. So I'd like to talk quickly about some of the work the enforcement team does in the district. It's important, sorry, to stress that the enforcement team really is seeking compliance before looking to carry out enforcement work. And this is gained through a range of things, from stakeholder engagement and communication to education and information provision, alongside things like having just a visible presence in the district can really help as well. Now, the restrictions that we've got in place are traditionally enforced by direct monitoring of activity at sea, as well as on the quayside, and that's still a really important part of what the enforcement team does. But remote monitoring is playing a much greater role these days, including with IVMS. So in the district, we've got 10-minute reporting on all the mobile gear vessels and 3-minute reporting whilst they're in MPAs, and that's an automatic thing. That's really key to monitoring compliance and allowing enforcement of spatial restrictions, and that's been a key priority really for the enforcement team for a number of years, with the aim really of protecting MPA features. So officers have undertaken, I think, 31 new investigations over the last year or so, which in terms of numbers might not sound like a lot, but it's actually an incredible amount of work which goes into building those case files and things, and includes 4 potential spatial incursions and 4 cases of non-reporting IVMS devices, which it's really good they're doing that work, but also having just 4 cases of non-reporting IVMS devices is quite a good rate as well across the size of the fleet that we've got. Then finally, on enforcement and compliance, just wanted to mention remote electronic monitoring. So the IFCA has been trialling REM on a small number of tow gear vessels in the district. Now that really shows a lot of promise actually in terms of combining gear in, gear out sensors with cameras and with IVMS, so that we can monitor and ensure compliance with the spatial and the gear restrictions in MPAs. So what you have is the vessel monitoring system continuously recording the vessel's position, speed, and course. And then the gear itself has sensors attached. And if the gear is put into the water, the system is all linked up and uses a logic chain based on the position relative to closed areas to work out basically whether the fishing is legal or not. So if the gear is down at any time that the boat's in a restricted zone, an alert's created at the point the infringement's made, and then the next time the gear is raised from the water, and it can flag and send video of those events to the IFCA directly. The various bits of technology on the vessels are also monitored remotely, and alerts are sent to the owner of the vessel and to the IFCA if any of the devices fail. And so if the gear sensors fail, for example, the system switches to an alert system that's based on vessel speed for monitoring MPAs, which is slightly less accurate, but alerts can quickly be dismissed if the gear can be seen on deck and if the vessel's just on passage through an MPA at low speed, but with further enforcement work required if that's not the case, obviously. There are also recognised benefits to fishers to being able to use that kind of innovation, which are becoming clear. And I think a wider rollout of the IVMS linked to REM could have real benefits for the work that we do in terms of MPA protection. I think I'll just spend a couple of minutes quickly on, well, not even that, on marine developments. I'll just put this up on the slide. This is kind of the context from the Marine and Coastal Access Act and from the IFCA vision about what the IFCA can do in terms of taking other steps towards making a contribution to sustainable development, as well as the IFCA vision, which includes championing inshore fisheries, which obviously rely on healthy and sustainable inshore populations of fish. And from our point of view, that provides a lot of scope for us to contribute to things like consultations on marine developments. So there might be marine developments from things like aggregate dredging or navigational dredging through to things like water abstraction for power stations or even offshore wind. And what we can do is sort of contribute to consultations on these to ensure that fisheries, fish, and their habitat are considered as thoroughly and meaningfully as possible by the marine developers, particularly in MPAs where those have kind of official protections. Oh, and just finally, a quick example of some of our work outside of MCZs and European marine sites, but within a triple SI, we've got an example of managing a small scale mussel fishery on the Tortorage estuary. So this chart just shows a few of the mussel beds that are surveyed each year by Devon and Severn IFCA officers, shown in the green with the orange transects. And we do these surveys basically to get a stock assessment of the mussels and then additional surveys of the cockles on the Tortorage. And we use that information to feed into a bird food availability model. So the SSSI is designated for its bird features. And we essentially want to make sure that any fishery that takes place in the area doesn't take too much shellfish away and leave the birds with not enough to eat over the winter. So that's something we've been doing for several years, but this year we've had a collaborative project looking at the oyster catchers as part of the Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment programme. So working with Natural England, Bournemouth University and EAD Ecology, basically building up more evidence around the oyster catcher use of the site, the oyster catcher use of the mussels and the cockles, to try and refine the bird food availability modelling that's done, so that we can refine the management of that fishery. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Obviously no questions now, but happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And thanks, Kate, Ryan, and Jess as well. We're at the end of our first session. We now have a quick break, 5-minute break. Let's get back 3 minutes past 2. And we'll go on to the 3 next talks. As I mentioned before, we'll have all the questions at the end. I see there's been already quite a few in the chat, all very interesting. So yeah, we'll pick them up later on. But I'll see you in 5 minutes. Thank you. Hello. We'll pick up again now. So the next presentation we have, well, we'll see. Danny, are you back?
Yes, I'm here.
There you go. So I think this is actually a great follow-up from the previous talks. We have Danny presenting the Wildlife Trust MPA recovery assessment. So I think that is a good summary of all the work and what happens with all these management efforts and what effects that has on our MPAs. So yeah, Danny's been working a lot on this with the Marine National Team. So very excited to hear it. Thanks, Danny.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yes, as Carly mentioned, so I'm Danny Clifford. I work as Marine Conservation Officer in the Wildlife Trust. And this is a little bit of a sneak peek of some work that we've done that we're about to publish before summer, an update as well. But to give you the background, I'm going to whiz through this because I'm conscious we haven't got that much time, but hopefully give you a good overview. So to give you the background, we were thinking a lot internally and externally with partners and others as well about the fact that we have a marine protected area network. But as has been mentioned already on this call, that's just the first step really in designation. The real question is our marine protected area network enabling nature to recover? Is it doing the job for which it was designed? So we started asking ourselves lots of questions, such as what is the actual condition of marine protected areas at sea? How is our network doing overall? And we realised that we have these marine protected areas, they all have numerous features, and that statutory nature conservation bodies report the condition of these individual features. But nobody at the time definitely had published an assessment of the state of our marine protected areas overall. So we decided to do our own assessment, which we have called the MPA Recovery Check Assessment, and we use statutory nature conservation bodies data on the condition of features to class marine protected areas, essentially into almost traffic light categories, and these are going to be mapped alongside activities as well. So really trying to understand how is our MPA network doing. So myself and a previous colleague with the Wildlife Trust, Emma Lowe, spent a lot of time looking at all the statutory nature conservation body websites, going through all 374 marine protected areas and extracting data on the features and the condition assessments that statutory nature conservation bodies had determined. This is really good insight into how hard it is to actually get all this data in one place. There is no database that's publicly available at the moment. So it took us quite some time, and we essentially gathered a huge spreadsheet. You don't need to read this, it's just to show we had a big spreadsheet that went behind this. And then we asked ourselves, so how do we develop a assessment methodology? The first kind of question that we spent a bit of time debating was, what do we include? What counts as a marine feature? We obviously want to do a marine assessment. For marine conservation zones and nature conservation marine protected area features for those sites similar to MCZs in Scotland, it's quite simple. They all pretty much are marine. But when you look at SACs and SPAs, for example, it can be a little bit interesting for some of the sites, particularly some in Scotland, which had kind of woodland that was designated as a feature of these protected areas. And we had some interesting discussions about whether we should or shouldn't include waders and breeding seabirds and intertidal habitats or not. So in the end, we decided to include all marine conservation zone and nature conservation protected area features. And then for SACs and SPAs, we decided to use the marine component advice that JNCC provided, where basically JNCC have said, we consider this to be a marine component or not. So we just included those that they said were marine components. The next kind of question that we asked ourselves was, what data is available? So conditional vulnerability assessments by statutory nature conservation bodies. So for England, that's Natural England and JNCC, is obviously the most appropriate thing to use for all marine protected areas. But we quickly realised there is a lack of data available here. So we thought about what we could use as the next best thing and essentially decided to use the general management approaches that were reported by statutory nature conservation bodies as a proxy where that conditional vulnerability assessment isn't available. So that's essentially the assessment mainly from when the sites were designated, which says the goal is to maintain this feature in favourable condition. So you can presume that we think that the feature is in favourable condition, or restore or recover this feature in to favourable condition. So you can presume that it's currently unfavourable. And then we came up with a assessment methodology to follow that was standardised. We applied this to every marine protected area. And we followed a one out, all out rule. So essentially, the marine protected areas, which we felt that we could put into a green category as we think they're doing okay, were all of those where all of the features are in favourable condition or with a general management approach of maintain. So we think they're doing okay based on the best available data that we have. For those where we saw that any feature was in unfavourable condition, or there was a general management approach of restore or recover, we followed a one out, all out rule. So we basically said, if there is one feature which is thought to be unfavourable within that marine protected area, that probably suggests that there's something going on within that marine protected area which isn't ideal. So we categorised it in this red category, kind of following a precautionary approach. And then we also had a condition unknown category for where we just don't have the data to assess the marine protected areas, or there were some cases where there might be one or two features out of a few that were in favourable condition, but we didn't know the rest. So we didn't feel that there was confidence to put it into that green category for that one. So we class those as unknown as well. I'm going to skip over this slide, but essentially this just shows in a bit more detail the condition assessments or the general management approach that went into each category. And when we come to publish this assessment, there is going to be a really detailed methodology statement. So this will all be available if people want to look at it at a later date. So essentially, we applied that to every marine protected area. We then did a little bit of a peer review. So we shared this with the local wildlife trusts all around the UK who know their local areas and the marine protected areas really well, and basically said, have we missed any data? Luckily, nobody came back and said we hadn't. Were there any that they thought this really isn't right? We don't agree with this. And there were very few cases where we changed some, and we've really clearly noted that just based on our expert opinion. Or, for example, where we found advice which basically said that there have been impacts to that marine protected area. We also shared the assessment with Natural England and JSCC and discussed with them, and they basically said we've got the best available data and our numbers are aligning. So did lots of kind of collaboration on this, which was great. There is a lot of difficulties and assumptions that came out of this, which tells you a lot about marine protected areas actually, and was really interesting. So first of all, we endeavoured to find the most up-to-date information, but there is a lack of data, particularly on condition assessments for SACs and SPAs. We did look when we first started this at just including data from the last 6 years, which is how often we would recommend marine protected areas are monitored, but very quickly realised that there wouldn't have been any data to base an assessment off, barely any that would have allowed us to do this. So we decided to include all condition and vulnerability or general management approach data, no matter its age, no matter its confidence, but we have really clearly noted that. So you'll be able to look at that as well when we publish. We included draft advice, but just noted it as well. And the other thing to note about the date of condition assessments, which I think is quite important when considering this, is that a lot of the condition assessments were before the avian influenza pandemic, which is likely to have influenced the condition of particularly those SPAs. So that needs bearing in mind as well. We came into some really interesting differences in how statutory nature conservation bodies report their methods and reporting, and had to work through those, but I don't have time, so I won't go into detail at the minute, but can talk through those if anybody is interested at a later date. As I mentioned, we only included marine component features. We used the general management approach as a proxy, so that's a big assumption as well. We didn't look at the attributes for features or targets just because that would have taken a huge extra amount of time to go and dig all that data out, and it's not very easily available. And would have added really a lot of complexity to the assessment. And just to note, because we are looking at features, but we've tried to basically provide an overall assessment for each marine protected area. That does mean that the marine protected areas with less features are more likely or reported as a whole word. There's some bias there as well. And the big caveat at the end is that we've classified every marine protected area in the whole site, if you like. But we know that most marine protected areas are not managed by whole sites. Some of the bylaws don't cover whole sites, for example. And because it's based only on the feature data, this assessment is a feature-based assessment. It's not an area-based assessment. So even though there will be a map that shows the marine protected areas and a colour code within them, it's not saying that whole area underneath that marine protected area is thought to be there. It's just the features that we've looked at as part of this. So just to note, we've endeavoured to be as clear and transparent as possible, and we're hoping to publish this before summer. And the idea is that there will be an interactive map, so you can click on every marine protected area and see the data that we've used, find the link to where we've sourced the data from, the date that we got it, all of that kind of thing. So it's going to all be there along with the detailed methodology and assumptions and limitations document. And that we are really open to feedback that anybody might have on this, and we're going to aim to keep the assessment up to date. So I'm going to give you a sneak peek of the results so far. I do need to caveat in that since we did this assessment, really great, some SNCBs have published some new condition assessments, so we need to go back and update it just a little bit. And we did this before the HPMAs were officially designated as well, so I'm hopefully going to add those before we publish it as well. So this, as everybody knows, I'm sure here, is the Marine Protected Area Network in the UK. And when you apply our assessment, this is kind of the colour-coded map that you see. And I've included the English stats here. So you can see, unfortunately, there is a lot of red. So we estimated that about 48% of English marine protected areas fell into that degraded or degrading category, with at least one feature thought to be in unfavourable condition or a recovering or restore general management approach, which isn't good. But I'm really optimistic, so I'm hoping that over time this map will turn more to green, and I hope that there's a role for Southwest marine ecosystems and this forum to look at where the data gaps are and the management gaps, and hopefully help support A, the condition assessments, and B, the management measures that are needed. And this is just to final slide, just to note, I wouldn't focus on these specific numbers too much, but the take-home message, really unfortunately, is that there is a lot of red across the board. There's a lot of marine protected areas which we don't think are doing well, and that really we need to turn the tide on that. That was a very whistle-stop tour. I'm going to leave it there because I know that we're running a little behind time, but I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thanks a lot, Danny. I'm sure everyone is really looking forward to seeing it published, and we'll be able to give a lot of feedback as well. So next we have Ruth. I think most of you might know Ruth. She was head of marine conservation at Cornwall Wildlife Trust, but she's now head of marine conservation at our national team, the Wildlife Trust. And she will be sharing that work on the blue carbon mapping project, looking at how much carbon is captured and stored in our seas, and also MPAs and what that could look for them, could look like for them. So Ruth, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks, Carly. Okay, hopefully sharing. Is that okay? Nods, that's great. Brilliant. So yes, thank you everybody. I'm Ruth Williams. I'm Head of Marine Conservation at the Wildlife Trusts. And I'm going to, like Danny's just done, give a fairly whistle-stop tour of the Blue Carbon Mapping Project, which is the world's first assessment of carbon stored and sequestered, and the potential for sequestration of carbon in our UK seas. Collating this evidence and the science underlying it has been quite a feat. So I also want to explain some of the next steps, what we want to do now to better recognise the value of our seabeds and those carbon stores, both for nature and climate benefits, but with particular relevance to our MPA network and the focus of today's webinar. I think in in this room or on this webinar, most of us know what blue carbon is, but just in case, blue carbon is the term that we use for carbon that is absorbed and stored in the ocean, in its habitats, in its animals, in the plant tissues. And up until recently, and it's really been based on the original IUCN definitions, blue carbon has really focused on these three coastal vegetated habitats, on our seagrass, salt marshes and mangroves. But there's one key habitat that is really missing here, and I'm not going to sing, but mud, glorious mud. Our UK wildlife, like our waders, our nephrops, our flatfish, so many other species, all think that mud is awesome. And unfortunately, we need to change a little bit of our thinking to be the same. And hopefully, some of the work I'm going to present on will explain a little bit why. So, the current mapping project that I'm talking about today really builds on some innovative work that was undertaken in Scotland in 2014 and 2017, and subsequently the blue carbon assessments of the North Sea, which were completed a couple of years ago in 2021. And these projects really showed that whilst difficult, these carbon assessments could be done. And so the Wildlife Trusts, together with WWF and RSPB, commissioned the Scottish Association of Marine Science to undertake this work to really map the extent and the distribution of all our blue carbon stores in the whole of the UK. It is very much a team effort. So like the brittle stars here, many arms hopefully made light work, or a little bit lighter as well. Not sure if Danny will agree with that. A lot of this came on Danny's shoulders. So as well as the project partners, it was really big thanks here to Bex Lyon and at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and Danny for their project management skills and making sure that this all was kept on track, and all of the amazing resources and outputs came out on time. Like I said, the research was completed by SAMS, and we were really lucky to have some key expert advisors and an independent advisory panel to help support the delivery of the project and ensure that cohesion with some of the other projects and other government initiatives that are going on at the same time. So how did we do it? Well, the research was undertaken in stages over 3 years, and it's been divided into 4 regional seas. So the English Channel and the Western Approaches, which is most relevant down here in the southwest area. We also did the Irish Sea and the Isle of Man and Scotland, and then this whole UK-wide assessment too, to produce this comprehensive inventory of all the blue carbon habitats across the UK and the Isle of Man's EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone, and right out to the continental shelf. So we mapped the extent and the distribution of all those blue carbon habitats. We also assessed the quantity of all of the carbon stored in each of those and the average sequestration rate per year. So how much carbon accumulates each year in each of those sediment types. So the results, how much is down there? Well, in the UK, we've got 244 million tonnes of organic carbon that's stored in just the top 10 centimetres of seabed. I'll come back to that in just a sec. Over 98% of that carbon is in seabed sediments, in that mud. It really puts it into perspective. Those sediments cover 885,000 kilometres squared, which is 3 times the size of the UK's landmass. So it's a significant habitat we're talking about. And up to 13 million tonnes of organic carbon is added annually to the sediment stores. And that's, as a bit of an analogy, that's about 3 times as much as UK forests accumulate per year. So our muds are pretty impressive. But I just want to stress that this, whilst that 244 million tonnes is a huge figure, it was really only in that top 10 centimetres. We're only looking at the tip of the iceberg, really. And that's because that's where we have the data. But it's also where the top layers are also at most risk of impact. So the figures that I've just presented and the ones just following in a minute, they are, and we acknowledge they are huge underestimates. There is an awful lot more sediment out there underneath those top 10 centimetres, and they store a huge amount of carbon as well, hundreds of metres of it. Just wanted to sort of draw down into the southwest a little bit and some of the figures for down here. So we don't, we have our fair share of the seabed sediments, and that adds up to 35.8 million tonnes, again in that top 10 centimetres of seabed. And we also have significant coastal vegetated habitats, and we've got 530,500 tonnes of carbon stored in those habitats, particularly in the salt marsh and the seagrass sediments, and also a bit in some of the kelp and algae habitats as well. And whilst these are very visible and they're often the more media friendly habitats, and they are really important, just wanted to sort of stress that they provide a much smaller proportion of our wider carbon stores when compared to mud. Oh, there we go. Didn't click in time. And we looked at how much carbon was also stored within and outside of our MPA network. And this is the sort of the crucial bit that I want to sort of focus on going forwards. In the southwest, we have looked at 111,000 kilometres or and a half thousand kilometres squared. And all of the carbon stored there, 32% of that is held within already designated MPAs. That sounds like it should be a fairly good thing, but as I think most of us know, there's significant threats to our blue carbon and our seabed habitats, and particularly from activities which disturb those seabeds, bottom trawling and developments being a key one. Both of those activities impact the sea floor, they disturb those carbon-rich sediments and potentially release that carbon that's stored back up into the atmosphere, and that can potentially worsen climate change. So in terms of offshore renewables and from fishing, this is a potential complete own goal. So it's great to know the science, and there's a whole raft of more detailed information, so please go and read the reports in detail. But we really wanted to focus on what now needs to change. So we've come up some key asks, which as a Wildlife Trust and as a collective partnership, we're trying to put forward to government and really drive some change. We need all of our MPAs to be protected from destructive activities that damage blue carbon habitats as well as threaten marine life. So as we know, a lot of our designated marine protected areas do not currently have what we would term adequate management measures in place, and they still allow some of these destructive activities to happen. It's our features-based approach, but that needs to change. We don't allow ploughing of our peatlands in protected sites. Why are we still allowing ploughing of our seabeds in marine protected areas? And we need to start to think bigger to achieve some of the gains that these sites can have in terms of both nature and carbon, those real win-wins. We also need to see improved planning of all of our activities in UKCs. So we're asking that blue carbon is embedded in our marine spatial planning, and that all activities should be strategically planned to avoid disturbance to areas of significant blue carbon, and where this isn't possible, to really minimise their impacts on these important habitats. We want to see blue carbon included in all environmental impact assessments, and that will clarify and incentivise industries, hopefully, to avoid and minimise their impacts using that hierarchy. And innovative solutions should be found to minimise the unavoidable impacts of developments where we can. We're an innovative nation. Let's start thinking of ways to stop having these impacts on our seabeds. And lastly on here, people eat fish. We export large quantities of fish, but we have to learn to do this better and to transition to more sustainable methods that are more in balance with the natural environment, that same environment that supports those fisheries. So we're not calling for a ban of all activity, full stop. What we need to think about is that holistic picture and a just transition to incentivise fishing industries away from some of these more damaging practices. And we are very aware that there's still gaps in our knowledge on blue carbon, and our seabed stores overall. And this report has really just highlighted that. We need to better understand both the carbon flux and the dynamics within that whole system a lot more fully. And that means more investment and some more research on blue carbon. And some of those pieces of work are already ongoing, and gaps are being filled through lots of other projects that are happening. The greenhouse gas inventory work, convex seascapes, all sorts of things are happening, and they'll help to answer some of those questions. But we need to start using some of the evidence that we've got now and not waiting for that full picture. So just to finish off, some take homes. Please do read and share the reports. They're all on our web pages on the Wildlife Trust's website. Mud is great, and it's a huge carbon store. Our marine protected areas contain 32% of our organic carbon here in the southwest, but most of it is currently unprotected as it's not a feature of those sites. Hopefully things like the MPA network review can help to look at that and make our MPAs a little bit more climate smart. They need to protect carbon as well as biodiversity, and we need to include carbon in our marine planning to avoid or minimise impacts and fill in some of the gaps in our knowledge. So back to the main focus for our webinar today is, is our current MPA network effective? Well, I think we've sort of heard and the potential is there, and we are making really great inroads into moving in the right direction. But there's bigger potential for these sites to protect both biodiversity and carbon. And the current features-based approach that we've got at the moment really prohibits the use of our marine protected areas to maximise all of those benefits. The results from these pieces of research and the science, the evidence-based projects that we're doing, things like the Blue Carbon Mapping Report, all need to be used now to sort of inform the decisions on how we better use our seas as a nature-based solution to climate change as well as for nature recovery. And in terms of the government rhetoric at the moment, I think we all get that balancing the pressures on the marine environment in terms of energy and environmental and growth commitments is a massive challenge for the government. But what we're proposing is that there's an opportunity to be transformative here, and we just need to implement the no-brainers, the win-wins, and we've got to do that with a bit more political will and urgency so that our MPAs could be used for both nature and climate action. So thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Very, very interesting. And last but not least, we have Liz Talbot. She's a marine ecologist at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and she's going to talk to us about climate smart marine protected areas and marine planning, so tying in very well with Ruth's talk as well. Over to you, Liz.
Okay. Can everybody see that? Can everybody see my screen? Okay, fantastic. All right, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about climate smart marine spatial planning, or specifically climate smart MPAs. So everything that I'm going to talk to you about today came out of a project called MSpace, which is Marine Spatial Planning Addressing Climate Effects, which was led by Anna Quiros at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. She can't be with you this afternoon, so you have me instead. But I thought, just to set a little bit of a context before I start talking specifically about MPAs, I did want to give you an idea of what MSpace was actually designed to do. So simply speaking, it was designed to support decision making around climate smart marine plans. So specifically, how do you incorporate the fact that climate change is changing the marine environment into your marine plans to make sure that your plans in the future remain effective and actually do what you intend them to do. And when we're talking about decision making in marine planning, basically that we kind of assumed that came down to two broad themes, which was either you prioritize a particular area within your planning area for conservation, or you exploit it by marine industry. The two aren't mutually exclusive, but it's kind of a useful distinction for us to make in this project. And when we're talking about decision making accounting for climate change, we really want to know what the marine environment of the future might look like. So we start with climate modelling for this. UK has incredible climate modelling capability, and we produce a lot of really, really nice data, but it's not used by policymakers or practitioners or planners because it's not actually easy for them to use. Lots of variables, strange data formats. So we have this stuff that we're not using and we really need to use it better. So MSpace really was just, we tried to take this really great data that we have and turn it into products that could actually be accessible and usable for policymakers and practitioners. We also wanted to know what stakeholders cared about. It's all very well us saying this is what your marine environment is going to look like, but you have to know what people prioritize in these areas. So we had a whole team of social scientists speaking to our stakeholders about what their priorities were for marine space, what they wanted the marine environment to look like in the future, how they wanted the space to be used. And once we have this information, we've identified which areas might be resilient or not resilient. We know what stakeholders are prioritising in an area. We started putting together hypothetical spatial management scenarios for them. So we usually, each case study, we had 4 case study areas, and each case study had 3 or 4 different scenarios that were presented to stakeholders, and they made different provisions for the area that was allocated for conservation, the area that was allocated for agriculture development, the area that was allocated for commercial fisheries or something like that. And once we had these different scenarios, we then had a team of economists that could look at what the economic implications of these scenarios would be. So if you develop this area for agriculture, how many jobs would that mean in the agriculture industry? But if that area is already fished, does that translate into jobs lost in the fishing industry? So we're trying to identify trade-offs as to what would happen with these different scenarios and how we were using marine space. So, I mean, obviously today I'm going to talk about the conservation bit, but I thought just kind of as context, I thought this could be quite useful as to what MSpace was actually designed to do. It's more than just what we're talking about today. So in order to identify these areas of climate resilient or climate sensitive areas, we used a spatial meta-analysis method. I'm not going to bog you down in all the details, but if I'm going to be talking about climate refuges and climate hotspots, I think you need to know how we got there. So we start with our climate change modelling evidence, and that can be biogeochemical models, it can be species distribution models. The type of model isn't really important. We just needs to be spatially explicit so that we can put it on a map, and we need a time series so that we can compare future time periods to present time periods. And we start by calculating individual effects, which basically just means for each model variable, how does it change in the future compared to a present day reference period? So our reference period for this was 2006 to 2025, so a 20-year reference period. And once we know what each model variable individually does, we calculate a summary effect. So that gives us an idea of how the whole ecosystem, as it is described by the model variables, changes. So rather than just saying to a policymaker, temperature is going to go up or pH is going to go down, we can say that the whole area that you're interested in is either going to be roughly comparable to the way it is today, or it's going to be different, and that difference is in line with climate change. And that can be quite powerful because it gives them a much simpler toolkit to work with than these vast tracts of model data that we produce. So once we've done the analysis, we can classify our ecosystem into basically 3 different states. We either have a climate refuge, so this would be an area where future ecosystem is kind of within the bounds of the variability that you'd see today. So it's roughly comparable to what we'd be looking at today. We can have a climate change hotspot, so that's where it's different, statistically different, and that difference is in line with the effects of climate change. And we also very occasionally get something called a bright spot. So it would be where the ecosystem is different, but that difference is actually not in line with climate change. So your temperature could go down or your pH could go up or something like that. They tend to be very short-lived. They don't hang around for very long. And they tend to be driven by kind of regional scale processes. So once we've been through our analysis, what we end up with is products that look something like this map. So this is a map of the Southwest, and I've put climate change refugia on here for variables that would be relevant to biodiversity conservation. So I'm going to put a little pointer on here. So down in this kind of out in the far Southwest, we've got these orange bars. So this is a refuge for benthic habitats. So the variables that went into the analysis to identify benthic habitats refugia would be stuff like seafloor temperature or seafloor pH or something like that. So out at the far Southwest here with these little orange bars. We've then got the solid yellow here. which would be refuge for benthic megafauna. So again, the variables that go into that analysis would be key drivers of distributions of benthic megafauna and some key prey species as well. And then we have the vertical blue bars here, which would be pelagic megafauna refugia. So that would be similar to the analysis would be similar to the benthic megafauna refugia, the benthic megafauna analysis, but you'd use water column variables rather than seafloor variables. So once we know where the refugia are, we can overlay the locations of MPAs on top of them, and we can see how MPAs might perform in the future, I guess. So what we have in the southwest is we've actually got some MCZs, which we would consider to be climate resilient in the future. So we've got the canyons down there and part of that southwest deeps, which overlap with this benthic habitat refuge. So the canyons was designated for cold water corals. I think the only cold water corals in English waters. So in terms of climate change alone, we would think that probably those cold water corals will continue to do quite well because they're sat in this refuge. There are other pressures on them, of course, not just climate pressures, but in terms of climate change, they could well do quite well under climate change. And then we have the southwest deeps, which I think were designated for kind of broad scale habitat features. So sandbanks, core sediments and things like that. So when we're talking about resilience there, what we're really talking about is the faunal communities that are associated with them would probably continue to be resilient. So that's probably quite good news for those particular MPAs. We've also got some this refuge for the pelagic megafauna that's actually quite close to the Isles of Scilly SPA. So there's seabird assemblages there. So if these seabirds are foraging in these areas that are projected to be climate resilient for pelagic megafauna, then that's probably their foraging environment is going to continue to be resilient in the future. So that could well be good news for them. And then we've got some refuge for benthic megafauna. So sometimes this analysis just kind of gives you added bonuses, I guess. So when we talk about benthic megafauna of conservation interest, generally what we're talking about is elasmobranchs, so sharks, skates, rays, that kind of thing. But they are not designation features for MPAs, and MPAs aren't managed for them. But what this analysis does say, actually, is that in these MPAs that are used by some of these species, they could probably continue to do quite well. So the habitat conditions, the foraging conditions for them will probably remain resilient, and that's good news. So, I mean, sometimes this information can be useful for other things as well. Elasmobranchs are fished in the UK, so fisheries management plans, can you use the locations of these MPAs that have climate resilient areas for megafauna in them as part of your fisheries management plan? It's also a few times has prompted discussion about how MPAs are managed, which Ruth touched on previously. And at the moment, MPAs are managed for features rather than at the whole site level. And probably if you changed the way MPAs were managed to be managed at the whole site level, you'd get a lot more benefit for a lot more species, including some of these benthic megafauna species that are using these MPAs. It's also quite important to know where the hotspots are going to be, I think. So this is basically the same map, but instead of refugia, we've got hotspots plotted on them. So the big orange stretch is hotspots for benthic habitats, and then the vertical bars again are hotspots for pelagic megafauna. So I think it's probably quite important to note that when I say hotspots, I'm not talking about some kind of barren dead zone. There'll still be things there, they might just be different. So probably your community composition will change. More climate sensitive species could well disappear while more tolerant ones hang on. We might get new species moving into an area because conditions change that suit them better. So we're talking about changes in community composition and probably changes in function when we're talking about hotspots for benthic habitats. So there'll still be things there, they'll just be different things probably. So as far as the Southwest goes, actually quite a lot of the network in the Southwest is going to be in hotspots for benthic habitats, which is maybe not necessarily good news. And we've also got this Bristol Channel Approaches SAC, which was designated for harbour porpoise. Some of that is going to be in a hotspot for pelagic megafauna as well. Now that site is quite big and it's only some of it that is that's in the hotspot. So how much difference that would make, it's difficult to say when they still have a fair bit of area that would maybe be less affected by climate change. But I think knowing where these hotspots are can give managers and practitioners a chance to consider if there's anything that we can do now to improve the climate resilience of these sites. So as we've seen already, quite a lot of these sites are still fished. They're disturbed in other ways. If you could reduce some of that pressure, could you maintain better functioning ecosystems even in the face of climate change? And I think that's kind of what we're really trying to get at with these analyses, is that by all means really look after your sites that might be climate resilient, but don't just forget about the ones that land in hotspots, because there's still probably quite a lot that you can do with them now to give them the best possible chance in the future. So we also we had a little look at what we call climate services, but is about carbon sequestration and how the MPA network could help with carbon sequestration in the future. We identified quite a big refuge for climate services around the southwest. I am going to add the proviso here that there is a level of uncertainty around how well the model projections that we used actually capture the processes that go into carbon sequestration. So just bear that in mind when I'm talking about this enormous refuge across the southwest. So basically what that refuge tells us is that the carbon sequestration potential of the seabed in the southwest probably isn't going to change that much. What it doesn't tell us is what that is how much carbon is being sequestered and what the carbon stocks in the southwest are. So the background color on the map there is the projected organic carbon stocks in the southwest. So yellow is 0, which is probably rock habitat, and then the darker the color, the higher the carbon stock is, the carbon density, and it's from that Smeaton paper that's referenced at the bottom there. So probably compared to other parts of the UK EEZ, carbon sequestration in the southwest probably not that high. I mean, we've got quite a lot of sand and coarse sediment down here. And as Ruth said, what you really want for carbon sequestration, long-term carbon sequestration, is mud. But that being said, a lot of the MPAs in the southwest are falling within this refuge. So there is probably still an argument to be made for protecting some of these. What we've also got is some areas of comparatively high carbon density that are actually outside the network, quite coastal areas that sit outside protected areas at the moment. So it could be that in the future you might want to look at those for designation. As Ruth said, there actually isn't a provision in England at all for designating for blue carbon habitats or for protecting carbon stores. So if the MPA network is going to be used for that, or if we want to use the marine space for this more, then probably that would need to change. But it's probably also worth noting that actually when activities in areas have been restricted to protect carbon stocks, it's very controversial. So the Isle of Man closed some of their waters to the Northern Irish Nephrops fleet last year, I believe, and it prompted some very strong statements from Northern Irish ministers. They were absolutely incensed that these vessels have been excluded, and I think some of that comes down to the evidence base around this, in that we think that restricting activities that disturb the seabed would prevent carbon being remineralized back into the water column, perhaps carbon being shunted back out into the atmosphere, but we don't know that for sure. So when these restrictions are being put in place, it's kind of based on the precautionary principle, and which I think is good, but it can be a really difficult sell for policymakers if you're going for evidence-based policy. The evidence that this really does definitely make a difference is not quite there yet. So it's something to think about when we are starting to have these conversations about protecting blue carbon habitats and restricting activities, that sometimes they can be a really hard sell. So that's kind of a brief whistle-stop tour of climate smart MPAs in the Southwest. If you do want to, we produced a really big report for the MSpace project, the early warning system. It covers the whole of the UK EZ, but it has a lot of detail, not just on conservation, but about fisheries and agriculture and all kinds of spatial management measures. So if you are interested in it, it has been published. It's on the MSIP website, so probably if you search MSIP, MSpace, you probably find it. And there's the full report. There's a policy for summary rakers. There's infographics. There's spatial data sets that you can download and look at yourself. So there's loads of stuff there if you're interested, or you can get in touch with me as well. Always happy to talk about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.